Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another podcast of the Young Professionals in Transplantation. My name is Dilan Dabare. I'm a kidney transplant surgeon in Birmingham, UK. And I've also got the privilege of being the chair of the Young Professionals in Transplantation subcommittee of ESOT. And we've been doing a few podcasts over the last year or so, and you can go back and see many of them on Transplant Live and also on Spotify. So it's great to be doing another one. And this time we're going to be focusing on leadership, crisis management over the next 3 or 4 podcasts. And I'm hoping that it's going to be useful for everyone. It's a hot topic. It's an important topic for all young professionals, coming through the ranks and going through their careers. So I've got a great guest for you today. He's very kindly given up his Sunday morning for us, and he's a great friend and colleague who I worked with before. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Peter Gogalniceanu is a consultant transplant surgeon at Guy's Hospital in London. His academic research focuses on healthcare risk management, business continuity, and crisis leadership. His latest work investigates the impact of armed conflict on civilian medical organizations. He holds a PhD in healthcare systems design from King's College London and is a graduate of Harvard Medical School's Safety, Quality, Informatics and Leadership program. He has held several educational leadership positions at UCL, King's College London and Harvard Medical School. He leads the Executive Fellowship in Surgical Leadership at King's Health Partners. So, Peter, it's a great pleasure to have you and to work together on something with you again.
Dylan, good morning. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Peter. So we were registrars together in Guy's, I don't know, about 10 years ago. A great place to work, busy, lots of transplants, lots of training, lots of great leaders in that place. And it was a good time, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I think as a surgical trainee in the UK, you get to travel around quite a lot. You get to see some fantastic examples of leadership at all levels and in all domains. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to talk about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, just to touch on that point you just made, actually, we do tend to move around quite a lot in our training, and we work in different departments, not only just in transplant but general surgery, and each department's got different sort of challenges, different personalities, and you do, as you go through the system, notice, isn't it, as a trainee and as a fellow, different styles of leadership, different examples of good leadership. I don't want to use the word bad leadership, but I'd say different styles of leadership. And you take those things on, isn't it? So as you go through the system.
Yeah, we always learn by imitation to start off with, and the environment is such a impactful way of picking up good and bad behaviors. And I think the leadership literature looks a lot at the styles and attributes of leaders. The most important thing, I think, as always, is to think about adaptive leadership. So trying to understand how your leadership behaviors adapt to the context and to the team that you're dealing with. The second thing to say is it's becoming increasingly fashionable. It's already very fashionable to talk about leadership in healthcare and in surgery in particular. And the problem with that is that we have this expectation that there are some very set criteria that makes a great leader. We know that's not true, and it's important that leadership doesn't become another buzzword like culture has or safety. These are really important concepts, but concepts that are used often out of context and often without having a very solid understanding of what leadership actually is. And I would say that it's important to start with the definition. Complex, big items like leadership or culture or cancer are often very difficult to define because they're so broad. So a lot of the leadership literature looks at how leadership is about uniting people behind a common purpose to achieve a particular task. The second problem with defining leadership is whether leadership has to be moral or not. Is leadership just the ability to get results? which is what Daniel Goleman defines it as? Or is leadership about the ability to get positive results? And it's only recently, if you look at the work of Barbara Kellerman, that people have associated leadership with moral outcomes. Okay, and that is another good point, because in surgical training, you often see people who are in healthcare, in any high-end profession, people who are fantastic at getting their outcomes, but it is to the benefit of one group at the detriment of another. So it's really important that we get that balance right. So the question comes back to, what is good leadership and what is leadership in the first place? And the best definition I've had is that leadership is the ability to move the boulder of goodness forward. Right, this is a definition by Nancy Cairn, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, and we've adapted that to healthcare by saying the leadership is the ability to drive positive change for those you serve. There has to be sort of a benevolent aspect to it. If you're just looking after your own interests, you're not a leader. You're just a very effective self-promoter. So that's where I would leave leadership. Leadership is the ability to drive positive change for those we serve.
That's a fantastic definition, and I think that it probably acts as a kind of a lighthouse, isn't it? In and gives you some form of direction. I often think about my work and healthcare, and simplify and try and simplify things to what I'm trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, what we're all trying to achieve, whether it be transplantation or any other field, is patient safety and patient outcomes. Yeah, it's all about the patient and making sure that is our goal. How do we improve patient care and maintain patient safety? So that is kind of the lighthouse to it, to what all this is about, isn't it? And then
Absolutely.
probably second and probably followed closely by training training and mentorship, so that the next generation of transplant professionals are also able to, kind of follow that.
So absolutely right. This sort of direction is really important. I mean, we call it deep purpose, and it comes from a concept which again has been slightly overused, but it's called your true north, right? So what is your guiding star? Where are you going with this? And we know surgery is very long training. It's a really hard life sometimes, especially in transplant, working nights and doing retrievals and getting on planes and relocating your family 20 times. So you really have to have a very deep purpose that guides everything that you do. And we've actually spent about 10 years in my research group trying to work out how to define deep purpose in surgery. And we came up with this phrase, which saying that the purpose of surgery is to alleviate human suffering in all its forms. And that is a really good benchmark to try to align everything that we do, whether it's prescribing someone painkillers or making sure someone who's got an abscess gets to theatre in time to alleviate their suffering and get it drained, or getting someone on the transplant waiting list very quickly. Okay, so the ability to alleviate human suffering has to be the deep purpose of anyone who's doing leadership in healthcare, because that is benevolent. It serves a higher purpose, and if we do it right, we can generate a lot of goodness out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, so we've defined quite nicely, what the purpose there is of leadership. Can I ask you maybe a question, a debatable question, or that often people ask and think about? Um, are leaders born, or are leaders um, made? Because it's an important question, because often, especially young professionals, may have a little bit of imposter syndrome in them and say to themselves, "Oh, I can never be that type of person. I don't think I can be that type of leader." They look at other people, more senior colleagues, and think, "Gosh, that person is really good, and I don't think I can be that." And so, are leaders born, or can they acquire the skills to be leaders?
So that's $1 million question, right? We live in a world where we like to think that we can achieve anything, right? Because we are much more reflective, we're much more sort of deliberate about the way we run our careers. I think the way I would answer that is to say that we can always improve our leadership performance. Our leadership performance is something that is continually decayed by our own internal limitations and also by the limitations of our environment. So you can have someone who's a fantastic, inverted commas, peacetime leader, someone who can build great departments, but completely loses it in theatre when they have a complication. And you can also have someone who's actually quite mediocre in their day-to-day life, but actually they come to light in a crisis situation. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I'd say is, as I get older, I realize that it's not as much that I can change in the world as I like to think. But certainly, if you look at the market of leadership literature or the publications out there, I would say that you have to have certain inborn characteristics, but as always, you have to build up on them. It's like with any sort of talent. If I were to swing on one side or the other, I would say it's learned. And I'd say that is highly dependent on the environment that we grow up in, the role models that we have, and the pain points that we meet in life then become our purposes. Because often people who achieve great leadership positions are driven by some sort of event that happened early in their life. I would call it a crisis. Other people would call it a crucible moment that makes you very sensitive or focused on a particular problem you feel passionate about fixing. And therefore, that is definitely something that it's learned or acquired at least. Because leadership is a behavior, you can certainly learn it because we, as humans, like I said, we imitate, we have role models, and often we acquire attitudes, habits, and values that we're not aware that we have from our environment. So I think certainly there's a learned component. But can I teach character? No. Can I teach courage? No. So those are definitely traits that leaders need to have, which are probably more to do with your inverted commas personality. I would say it's probably 75 acquired, 25% inborn.
It's such a complex topic, isn't it? And also, if you think about the reality of life and the reality of your workplace, is that often you are thrown into leadership positions. The chief of your department retires, for example, and you're the most senior person or the next in line. You don't really want to do it, but you might be the one. Or even at a more junior level, you might be the most senior registrar, the most senior SHO. So so it's not just at the very top, but it's also at a middle level as well. So by definition, you're always leading, and so you're always developing your skills, your attributes, and you don't have to be the perfect leader, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think of, so that there's again a really fantastic point because sometimes leadership is thrust upon you. And actually, a great act of leadership is to pick up the fight without expecting to pick up the fight. And if we talk about failures and we talk about at what point you need to pick up the fight, there are plenty of examples of people that are very young who've been put in those positions. Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world and had died before he was both of our age. Okay, so I always feel very humbled by that. And a lot of people became generals in their 20s, prime ministers in their 20s, and even now there are other professions that are safety critical, and I'm going to mention here aviation, where you can be 29 years old and be a captain, and you can be flying 400 people across continents and oceans. We put our loved ones in their hands, and they do a fantastic job. So that shows that, and that is a great leadership role because you not only have to master the technical aspects of your job, you also have to bear a huge amount of decision-making responsibility. So in healthcare, we've sort of forgotten that. We want people to be very, very senior to be put in a leadership position. And that means we keep down the leadership education and development of people because we say, well, not yet. You're not quite there. And what the literature shows is that people who become leaders in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are people who had early exposure to leadership opportunities. So, getting your kids involved in projects where they get to lead and picking up leadership positions as someone who's finishing A levels, that is really important because it exposes you to those situations, which brings me to the concept of failure, which is leadership doesn't have a curriculum, or not yet. We've published a paper. Hopefully that's going to become the curriculum. Please look it up. But we don't know. We're not guided how to become good leaders. And therefore, the process has to become trial and error at times. the classic leader who messed up so much, but then became very famous is Churchill. Churchill got it wrong several times in the First World War. He had a number of very visible failures. He became prime minister without particularly being wanted by the establishment. And then, as we knew, turned it around and often perhaps embellished his achievements, but certainly an example of someone who did not have the traditional leadership path. And in healthcare, especially in surgery, we have to feel that life has to be this continuous strings of achievements and awards that propels us from one lower step to a higher step all the time. And it really isn't the case. Failure is so important in what we do. And I would advise anyone who's interested in this area to look at the work of Amy Edmondson, from Harvard Business School, who talks how you can fail forward, how you can fail better, and how you can use failure as just a means of acquiring data on your own performance journey. Now, obviously, in safety critical professions, you have to fail in certain ways. You can't, there are certain critical failures you just can't afford to have because we're dealing with human lives. But there are micro failures all along the way, whether it's in the way we perform in a end of year performance review. We call it ARCP in the UK, but in Europe and the US, we can call it other things. Whether it is, the way we learn a new procedure, especially learning new procedures as consultants. Robotics is now a big thing in transplantation, and a lot of us having to sort of go back to school really and learning how to do it, as the generation before us did when it was to laparoscopy. So those failures are intrinsic, and you mustn't be afraid to fail.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Peter. That's really good. And a lot of the stuff you're saying, we'll hopefully put it on the show notes so that people can look them up, and papers and other authors to read on as well. I wanted to touch on one of the things you mentioned earlier around character, and how your own personal character and your own personal leadership of yourself first and foremost is important, in order to lead others. Do you have to maintain a reflective environment of yourself and be as good a leader of yourself in order to be a good leader of others?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It's something that was much more common in the older literature on this, as in like the 20s and 30s. And I remember my own grandfather telling me that if you can't control your own emotions, you can't control others, or you can't influence others in a good way. And that's really important. So it all starts with yourself. It starts with your purpose and the way you are able to drive positive change in how you grow yourself as a leader. But character is a really big one, because we've all seen people who are fantastic professionals, really talented technicians. It doesn't matter whether it's doing complex surgery or landing planes, or being the chief executives of companies, or entrepreneurs. Character, and again, a great book here by Admiral James Stavridis. Character is the ability to do the right thing, even when it's hard and even when no one's looking. All right. And so often people get lost along the way because there are commercial pressures, promotion pressures, peer pressures at work, the desire to save face and keep your reputation, that you take the wrong turn in life. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that it's just difficult. And what's really hard is to come back from that. So character is the ability to do the right thing. And if you don't have that, the higher you climb in the leadership ladder, the bigger the temptations get, more complex the decisions. And character is about, I think, having compassion to your colleagues, being able to give feedback whilst being kind, being able to help people even when you have no reason to help people. And it's about keeping alignment to that moral compass that stops you from making compromises. And often that means, to be honest, paying the price with your own career. Healthcare is an extremely competitive environment, and there are a lot of performance pressures that are not that overt. And it takes a very strong character to be able to stay on your desired path.
And I guess also you got to see yourself as but you're a leader as a servant, isn't it? So there are things that you need to sacrifice for the betterment of the goal that you're trying to achieve. And so in this case, maybe good patient care. and also um, for the improvement of your colleagues and mentors and trainees. So there is a strong element of being a servant as a leader.
Absolutely. And if you look at, um, being the leader is not being the boss. You're not sitting on a dais on a desk and you're pointing at people saying you do that. Huge amount of work comes out from this idea of servant leadership, which initially sounds a little bit sort of pretentious or a little bit sort of disingenuous. But if you look at history, people say that a prince is the first servant of his people. If you look at, I think Sandhurst Military Academy, they talk a lot about servant to lead. They talk about the troops always eat before the officers. So your duty is to look after those placed in your charge. And that is where you derive your authority to lead. In the same way, in a democratic government, government needs to occur with the consent of the governed. So the process of voting gives authority to the leader to lead. In a more general leadership environment, your authority to lead is derived from your commitment to caring for those who trust you. And this is why, and we have many examples in UK democracy and democracies out of the world, when someone betrays that trust, then they have to resign because you've lost the right to lead. So service is absolutely at the center of that.
Yeah, so that's and that should come in a it's not just a word. It should come in the practical elements of what you do on a day-to-day basis, isn't it?
So we see this all the time, social interrupt, because I'm pretty passionate. The senior registrar, the old-fashioned senior registrars. You can't expect your juniors to bring you coffee. Okay, I'm sorry, guys, that's out.
Yeah.
All right, you can't get people to write your audits and papers for you. That's completely out.
Yeah.
You're there to coach, to mentor, to be a friend, to
Yeah.
be an older sibling, to pick up, and this is what you mentioned earlier about emotional intelligence, to pick up that someone's underperforming on the ward round, not because they're lazy or because they have a bad attitude, but maybe there's something going on at home. Maybe there's a sick child or a relationship problem or parental ill health, or perhaps they have career anxiety. And it's down to the leader to pick the fine signs and try to address that rather than take that very blunt and unsophisticated approach of just hitting someone, as it were, blasting them or criticizing. And that's another important thing. Never criticize in public. You always praise in public, you criticize in private. That is so important, I think. And I think we have a younger generation of consultants. Maybe we kind of picked that up, but certainly I was on the wrong end of receiving that when I was training. So yeah, it's something that's quite close to my heart.
I can attest to that as well. It is getting better, I think. I wanted to pick up on a word you said earlier, compassionate leadership. This seems to be a term now that's quite, often seen in leadership literature,
Mhm.
and lots of books written about it as well.
Yeah.
Um, and in your view, why is that important? What makes a good compassionate leader? And
Yeah, so yeah, it's really important. I think you have to be, as a leader, you have to be kind. That you have to lead with kindness, and you have to understand that we often deal with human beings that are threatened, that are in some sort of physical or emotional pain, or people that, certainly working in certain healthcare environments are deconditioned by lack of sleep, lack of food, dehydration, cognitive overload. And then when you put a human in those situations, they automatically decay their performance. Okay. And I think compassion is about understanding where that person's coming from. And often I think it's understanding that humans have performance limitations, full stop. Some people are more able than others in certain topics. I'll be terrible if you expected me to do ballet right now, or to paint, or to sing. But it doesn't make me a flawed human for doing that. And compassion is about understanding that some people simply cannot give you what you want them to give you. And if you try to go beyond that performance threshold, all you're doing is either upsetting them, creating moral injury, or you are destroying your professional relationship with them. So it's really important to know when to back down, but to be able to do that without grumbling and sort of having negative thoughts about that person, you have to be compassionate. You have to understand that we all have our flaws, and that's okay.
Peter, this is Sunday morning. The thought of you doing ballet is the last thing I need right now. So
Thank you.
let's keep that
So thank you for your compassion, Dylan. Thank you for your compassion.
Let's talk about that later. Um, and the other point I wanted to touch on, and the word you mentioned earlier, adaptive leadership. So, what I, you're going to tell me what that means, but one of the things I guess that's important in the field of transplantation is the constant change that we see in the
Mm.
in our workplace, right? There's major changes. So there's changes in the organizational structure, new things coming on.
Mhm.
You're often, as a leader, being faced with new concepts, new ideas. For example, xenotransplantation, machine learning, machine perfusion. And as a leader, you may get other colleagues who are interested in these things, trying to introduce new things into your department. Um, and you as a leader have to take that on all those things on board, and it's really difficult, isn't it, to say, all right, okay, so number one, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Should I, if I say no to this, will I shoot down my colleague who's really enthusiastic about it? Is it is actually beneficial to the patient? How do I navigate that? And it's a constant thing because as a leader, you're often having new things thrust upon you. And is that where adaptive leadership comes in?
Oh, that's a really good question. Wow. So yeah, I think to go back to your point, I think we don't innovate enough in transplantation. We've been late adopters with a lot of technology, and now we are literally, I think, on the brink of uh, I don't want to say the word revolution, but the brink of a sort of a critical inflection point where, xenotransplantation, robotic surgery, AI, all of these things are coming in, and we're going to become, I think, a very fertile, even more fertile in what we produce. And then the question is, how do you choose, right? So choice is about strategy because strategy is about policy, and policy is a series of choices that impact on outcomes. And as a leader, you have to work out the strategy, which is based on your vision, which is based on your purpose. But the problem there is that you try to become super controlling at a tactical level and you start micromanaging because you feel you should be in charge of everything. And if you look at high level leadership, it's all about delegation. Find people who are good for the job and then give them the freedom to go with it, give them the right to fail, hold them accountable when they fail if that failure was avoidable, but create that psychological safety of allowing people to try things out and hand out the excitement and the accountability of leading at a tactical level. Because the truth is, especially if you run a big transplant unit where you're codependent on other people, or if you run a research lab, or if you're a PhD supervisor, you can't hold people by the hand all the time. That's the beauty of being an adult. It's the freedom and the autonomy of trying things out. And if you look at people that have successful research experiences as PhD students or as trainees, it's always when you've been allowed to pursue things that interested you, and you have a supervisor that mentors and coaches you, but doesn't actually check on what you do every single day and how many mice are sitting in your lab at the moment. That is a stifling environment, and it's not great for creativity. So that's an example of adaptability. You also have to adapt to circumstance. So am I dealing with something that's super critical and sort of an emergency where you do have to have a more directive leadership style? You have to say, you do that now. But also you have to have the ability to act in peacetime, what we call it in the avoid phase, where you're just dealing with background latent threats. And then you can be more consultative. You can say, well, what do you think about this? Or you can have an NDT, or you can have a lab meeting. And then there you are more sort of trying to get information out of the experts in the room. Now, you can imagine if you do that the wrong way around, you know, saying, well, what's the latest research on hemorrhage control when someone's IVC is sort of injured? You can't be like that. And often I think people who are either great in crises approach that sort of warlike mentality in elective situations, and you upset people and you bulldoze over people. And similarly, people who are very reflective can become a little bit indecisive in a crisis. So adaptive leadership is about trying to think, am I in a normal state of function? And am I in a non-normal or an undesired state where I have to kind of work to a timeline? Or am I in a supercritical phase where actually I just need to fix it myself? So I would say that in an elective situation, as a leader, you have to be strategic. In a non-normal situation, you have to be operational. And in a critical situation, you have to be very much tactical. So grab the clamp, put it on the IVC, take it from there. But equally, I've seen consultants dealing with ruptured spleens and lying at the edge of it. And what a great way of building someone's confidence to say, I think you're ready. Please do it. I'll be here, but I think you can do this. And often in surgery, I think we underplay our ability. On average, certainly in the world we grew up, people are well trained, people can do it, but you need a mentor and a leader to give you the confidence to actually act on it.
Thanks, Peter. So I can see that you're slowly starting to get into your real passion on crisis management. So I'm going to draw you back from that because that's another podcast, and we're going to stick to peacetime leadership here, not
Okay. Right.
not wartime crisis leadership. Another concept we spoke about before we came online is about leadership domains. What
Yeah.
what are the various types of leadership domains?
So I think they are, leadership domains does not refer to styles or to leadership aptitudes, and those are different things. But I would say that as a leader, you have to focus on 4 areas of performance, okay, which we should all have put together, but we don't always do that. I think the first way is the way we manage our environment, our climate that we work in. So how do we build effective environments that are conducive to high performance? So if you're a department lead, you may say, well, actually, I'm going to start a new robotic fellowship, or I'm going to start a new endocrine fellowship, or I'm going to employ a colleague that would be able to add something new. And that part of that is actually also how you build culture, because culture is part of that environment. It's a palpable thing that's difficult to measure. And it's about what attitudes and values you bring to that world. The second thing is about the way you deal with people. And I think that's something that often we think that if we're very good surgeons or very good technicians, we can be a little more brusque and sort of just be more demanding of people. And as you get more senior, you're either going to become better or worse at dealing with humans. But if you don't have followers, you can't be a leader. So it's getting that balance between motivating and inspiring, but also driving and managing people. And also, it's important to understand that you have to have good morale in your team without impacting on discipline. Okay, and that balance as well. The third thing to say, I think, is it's important how you manage opportunity. So you have to be an entrepreneur and a catalyst as a leader. You've got to drive things forward, and that takes courage. It takes confidence. And then finally, it's about how you deal with risk. It's how do you manage threats and errors, and how do you insulate your team from things that are about to come. And often we say you have to see around corners. You have to be like a chess player, 10 moves ahead. And often people think, why are you doing that? Or why are you being so neurotic about something else? And actually, oftentimes their eyes are closed. You're trying to see what's about to happen, and you're trying to preempt and anticipate. And again, that's something that perhaps we're not always that good at. Yeah, so those are the sort of the 4 domains of leadership practice.
Amazing. Thanks, Peter. That's really good, and that's a lot of food for thought that we've covered in this podcast. And you've signposted some fantastic reading as well. And as we've said at the start, this is not a easy topic. There's no one book on it, one podcast on it. But hopefully this conversation we've had has made people think about various concepts, various topics, reflect on what their leadership is and what the leadership around them is. So, Peter, thank you so much for taking your Sunday morning for this. And of course, this is only part 1. We've got part 2 and 3. We've got the next part coming up on Peter's real passion on crisis management. And he's a real expert on that. So please come back to us for that. And also culture change, and really, really important topic that's going to be coming up as well. So Peter, thank you so much for your time. Get you back to your family now. And we'll meet up soon, and look forward to seeing everyone at the next podcast. Thanks, Peter.
Dylan, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure chatting. And I will add on the references and the links. So find me on Twitter or online. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. See everyone soon, and we'll catch you on the next podcast. Take care. Bye.